Okay, so we're going to start with the first session on writing. And I'd like to thank John for giving us such a nice deep dive into his work. Because sometimes you see the deepest possibilities through somebody who's really spent a lot of time going very, very far into the depths of the scholarly realm. I'd like to also note that many of the things he was talking about were about Melville's writing, Melville as a writer. And I would like to very much encourage people to think about annotation as a synthetic process, as a process of bringing the reading together with the writing. And you saw that very extensively with Melville's own annotations. And so this process of using annotation to generate writing and to engage in the activity of writing is critical. I should also note, I've used the tool in my own classes for writing extensively, and I've been amazed. I had students once just do a notebook of their annotations, and for every student, without exception, it was the most interesting paper they wrote that term. They handed in their notebook. It had to be edited and made into full. I gave them the option of either doing a series of. It was just one assignment. It was a 5-page assignment. A series of 5 one-page essays, which are really, really hard to write, or a set of critically and carefully edited notes. But they were absolutely fascinating. They had 4 assignments, so this was just one assignment. But so I'd like to, again, emphasize the writing aspect. And when I think of annotation studies, I think there would be, if such a field in a journal or whatever existed, there would be an entire section that would be reflecting on writing activities and annotators as writers. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have and discussants, because this is very much a session we're going to do about 10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes each person, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. First will be Suzanne Lane, who's here at MIT. I think many of you know Suzanne's work. She's the Director of Writing, Rhetoric, and Professional Communication. Has been here for a number of years, and in fact, probably longer than many, many MIT people in the audience, because she took her first degree at MIT as a chemical engineer. And she then went on to a master's in creative writing and a PhD in English. So Suzanne has a very wide experience in all the different dimensions of what we're talking about in annotation. Her research interests are in contemporary rhetoric, genre theory, and argumentation. And she has a new research group that is organized around her teaching unit, which is called Archimedia, yes. So it's Archimedes and media. I love the, but it's also architecture and media. And she's thinking about many different research possibilities in the area of professional communication. So we have also Alex Mueller from the University of Massachusetts. And Alex is an assistant professor of English in the College of Liberal Arts. He's working currently on a study of prehistory of digital textuality, referring to contemporary antecedents of contemporary blogging, wiki editing, social networking. And it's I've seen some of his work. It's this marvelously interesting exploration of the things that people did before digital existed, and it turns out that they were doing what we're doing now. So I think sometimes we think the digital is totally reinventing everything, but obviously
that's just YouTube.
It is not. He's also interested in how pre-modern textual practices have shaped the hypertextual character of digital environments. And Mary Isbell from the University of New Haven is an assistant professor of English and director of first-year writing there. And she's also the co-director of the research into amateur performance and private theatricals in interdisciplinary scholarly networks. So she actually studies theater groups in the 19th century. She's very interested in this field, which is very much something that is opened up by digital scholarship. And she also combines work as a communications educator with digital humanities in the belief that students can and should contribute work to academic disciplines through the use of digital practices. So these are three very experienced individuals, and they are exploring the possibilities of Annotation Studio as a framework for student and profession and academic writing. Suzanne.
All right. It's lovely to see so many of you here. What I'm going to talk about today is really laying the foundation of using Annotation Studio with students. And by students, I mean first-term college students who have just recently arrived from high school with all their high school practices intact and without scholarly practices yet formed. So the context in specific that I'm talking about is a rhetoric class that I just taught this fall. And when I, in general, ask my students, what is their reading practice? How do they annotate texts? They tell me that they use a highlighter. And when you use a highlighter, you make some parts of the text more visible, but you don't say anything about it. And when I ask them how they write, they say, well, after I've read, I sit down and I think until I know what I'm going to say, and then I write my paper. And that's very much of a high school practice. But it doesn't get you very far in scholarly or academic writing. And so they really need to learn many new capabilities and strategies. And the first thing that they need to learn is what can be said about a text. That's what they don't know. When they simply highlight, they recognize that parts of the text may be more interesting or more important than another part, but they don't know what they can say about it, what might be meaningful as a response or an interpretation of that text. And that is very difficult for them. So one of the things that I do in Annotation Studio is I slightly seed the text with a few of my annotations. And you see, hopefully you can read this. The very first, the top annotation there is something that I wrote about what Mario Savio was saying. They were annotating speeches as their first act in this rhetoric class. And I tagged it with the term analogy. But as you can see, that was my one contribution. And then students contributed theirs. And one of the way I did this, which I think is important, is that each student had their computer open in class, and they annotated what they noticed. And so it was fairly sparse on each screen. But I had the projector up showing everything that was happening. And when the students looked up and saw how much annotation there was, they were amazed. And I think, as Jim pointed out earlier, this is a generative process. When they see a text that has been annotated extensively, they gain lots of insights about what can possibly happen here, what kinds of things can be said. And because they're all saying, coming from their own perspective initially, saying different kinds of things, it gives them a really rich sense of what is possible. So that's the first way in which it really begins to re-envision for them what this process can be. As they continue with this process, it becomes a form of collaborative analysis of the text. And again, I don't know if you can read this, so I'm going to read it for you. The very first student who annotated here at the top says, "Very cool line," which is great, right? Lots of enthusiasm, appreciation for the text. We want that, but doesn't go any further. The next student just points out, labels it as pathos, and points out that it's an appeal to emotion, in other words, pathos. But this student is doing something very different from just appreciating the line. This student is applying the new rhetorical conceptual terms to isolate and identify parts of the text and how it's working. And then the final student builds on that and has, actually I think for a first-term freshman, quite a nice insight about what Savio is doing, and writes, diction of anti-capitalism, that is, comparing their situation to an autocracy, firm analogy. Only firm should be in quotation marks there, but that's fine. So you can see how by being led to notice something that another student has noticed, and then wanting to say something new, not just repeat what another student has said, a conversation deepens about the text. Now, this is what we always hope will happen in our classroom discussions. And often it does. But classroom discussions are ephemeral. And they dissipate as soon as students leave the classroom. Whereas in Annotation Studio, this becomes permanent and students can go back to it all through the writing process. And so in many ways, reading itself, the annotation that Annotation Studio allows, at the act of reading, before students are writing longer arguments, getting anxious about whether they know what they're doing in a first critical paper, they are already engaging in scholarly deliberation with each other. And I think that's crucial, that this scaffolds the process because they can do it micro level first with each other in this platform before they have to develop an extended monologue, basically, in their own paper. The other thing I want to talk to you about is how I use this for peer review in the classroom. And just as my students have rather limited strategies for reading and writing when they come into college, they have a very simplified and reductive view of peer review. They've often been asked to do something called peer editing in high school, and they see this process as trying to find the grammatical and punctuation and spelling problems that are going to get points taken off by the teacher, which is not at all what I want them to do. That I want them to be thinking in terms of scholarly peer review. One of the really nice things about Annotation Studio, I think, is that it places the student text in exactly the same platform, the same intellectual space as the published text that they've been annotating. And so I think there's a lot of knowledge transfer that happens from how they have learned to annotate text that they're analyzing and writing about to how they then approach annotating their peers' text. And that in itself, I think, helps to get them out of that peer editing mode. Now, it doesn't automatically do that. I did have one student in this class who was a self-described grammar Nazi who started the peer review process by noting all the places where semicolons should have been and were not. But they were in groups doing this, and her fellow students weren't doing that, and you could watch the progression down the page as she became entangled in conversations that were beginning to happen about the text and about the student writer's interpretation of the text. So again, I think because this can happen collaboratively with students seeing what each other are doing, rather than going off, I think one of the things that's important to recognize is that for a very long time, we have treated student reading and writing as if it's in a black box. They go off and do this in their dorm room or somewhere else in the library alone. And then they come back and we see the products of it. This makes all of that visible not only to us, but also for them to each other. And so I think that really enables the learning process. So one of the things that I think we can just see visibly here is that they are highlighting many very specific features of each other's texts and responding to that more extensively. It doesn't allow them to just, sort of circle and then give that was really great, I really like that. It was so relatable at the end. All right. So what did they actually say? I did not tell them to do this. They started doing this on their own. They started applying the same tags with rhetorical concepts to each other's text as they had when they were annotating the speeches. And I see that again as a sign of knowledge transfer, which I think is just fantastic. But it's knowledge transfer with an adaptation for the peer review context. This is not just commenting on the text, this is responding directly back to the writer with some suggestion for revision, but still using the conceptual categories. And then finally, I think what actually happens by the end is that students are engaging in a conversation, reading each other's text in the context of the ongoing critical conversation that they've been having about texts and rhetoric. And so the highlighted part here is one of my students responding to another student's claim that something is happening sort of the way the theorist Spitzer would have said about the rhetorical situation, but not really. This is a common first attempt at interpretation, right? It's kind of the same, but it's a little bit different. And she asks him, how exactly is this not Spitzerian? Which I think for a first-term freshman is an incredibly sophisticated question. And the conversation keeps going and deepening from that point. And so they're really having critical conversations at the peer review stage. The peer review is now a continuation of the critical conversation that they started about the text when they were critiquing the text. So that's really, in many ways, just a baseline of the kinds of things that can happen, having students collaboratively annotate and then collaboratively peer review in this platform. And I know the others are going to build on this and go into much more detail. But I wanted to start us off with things that I think are really fundamental.
Alex, you're next. Alex Mueller.
Thank you, Jim, for the introduction, and thank you to Rachel and Kurt for organizing this workshop. I'm really excited to be a part of it. Rather than go into more detail than Suzanne about the Annotation Studio, I'll actually probably go into less because I'm at an earlier stage. I used it for the first time this last term. But I wanted to start by explaining a little bit about my own research interest in annotation. I'm a medievalist, and so I'm very much interested in medieval manuscript culture, academic commentaries that appear within medieval manuscripts. And I'm working on a couple projects right now that relate to commentary or annotation. One is a collaborative research project that I'm working on with a Renaissance colleague of mine at UMass Boston, Scott Maizano, and a team of undergraduate researchers. We're calling it Academic Commentary 2.0. And we're coming at this from kind of a deep historical viewpoint because of, and this is of course something that has been noticed by the creators of Annotation Studio, the surprising similarities in the visual presentation of commentary and the relationship between the target text and annotation, as well as the elevated authority of commentary. And that seems to be the shift that I think that's quite interesting within digital platforms that include annotation. The other project is my book project, which I'm tentatively calling Words with Friends. And hopefully by the time it gets published, people will forget what that is. But I'm looking at what I'm calling either the reemergence or sometimes the persistence of pre-modern textual modes within mostly read-write platforms on the web, emphasizing the dynamic interplay between reader and writer. And there are lots of examples I could give, ones that I treat in this project, but the one that I think is most useful to think about within the context of annotation is medieval manuscript commentary on Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables were a common classroom text throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. And one thing that's really striking if you look at medieval manuscripts that contain Aesop's fables is just the overwhelming amount of commentary, handwritten commentary. And they usually are focused on moral or allegorical interpretations of the fables. And they include commentaries upon commentaries, which has already been discussed today. And so when the printing press arrives, you have an attempt to kind of replicate this emphasis on commentary. And there are examples like this one that I think are a bit awkward in the way that they try to kind of replicate the mise-en-page of the medieval manuscript. And it also, at the same time, because it fills up so much of the page, it reduces the possibility of commentaries upon commentaries, and makes it a little bit less dynamic. Although there were some printers that came up with more elegant formats that allowed for more marginal space, that included a printed commentary as well as opportunities in the margins for handwritten commentaries to be added. So that's a very brief, just kind of explanation of my research interest in this, and I want to use that as kind of a springboard to talk about the way I'm using this in my teaching. And as I mentioned at the outset, I'm a novice with Annotation Studio. I used it for the very first time this last term, and I used it with a first-year composition course. And like most things that are new to me in teaching, I try to use like the very minimal aspects of that new tool in order to make sure that I don't overwhelm myself or really confuse the students, essentially. So I wanted to, on a basic level, wanted to get students to do something that Suzanne mentioned, which is to get them to annotate their texts. It's not something that's not a practice that's actively often taught in high school. I'm also a former high school English teacher, mostly because the readings that students do in the classroom are on texts that are shared school texts that they're told not to mark up, right? So it's a difficult transition for many students, especially in these early college courses. So I wanted them to actively annotate the course readings, but I also wanted to get them to engage in rhetorical modes that we would be focusing on in formal papers. And I'll explain to you what I mean by this as we go on here. Actually, before I get to that, I just wanted to mention also that I decided to use Annotation Studio in particular because I wanted it to be a social platform. And I learned a lot from Suzanne and her uses of it, and I already am going to revise the way I use it in the future. Because I don't think I maximized its social capabilities, and so I think when we talk afterwards, I'll be interested to hear some other ideas about that. But I wanted the students to be able to track their own commentary, and those of everyone else ideally engaging in conversations about texts. And I found, and this is mostly just impressions from a semester that is not too far away. That students indeed became active commentators, largely exceeding the 3-comment minimum. I only required that they add 3 comments, which I thought was a really minimal requirement. But they often exceeded that requirement and provided expansive notes like this one that also engaged in the rhetorical mode that I wanted them to engage in. In this case, this was a comparative comment that is analyzing one line from Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay on friendship and comparing it to Cicero's treatise on friendship. So they practiced these modes with the idea that they would then translate that that learning to a formal paper that was focused on that mode. So here's language from the comparison paper assignment. And I found that this was a largely successful transition. I think it led to more thoughtful papers. They were already practicing these modes, and so it became a more natural transition from the reading and adding comparative notes to actually writing a more formal comparison. And they did this with a number of different rhetorical modes. Now, the most interesting thing that happened during the revision stage, and this is something that I did quite differently than Susanna. I didn't have students put their papers on Annotation Studio, and I think that was a big mistake, actually, based on what she said, because there was something lost in transition, and the revisions. I thought they were particularly good. But here's one example, and it's not a typical example, but I did run into this problem with other students as well, that when I offered using the comment feature in Microsoft Word, when I offered comments or questions, rather than actually take those questions as suggestions for revision, this student in particular, just defended his choices about why he did what he did in the paper, or maybe answered some of my questions in the dialogue of the comment feature in Word. And so there were no changes to the actual draft itself. But it was fascinating to me because revision after revision from the student, I would see this, and I did have varying degrees of this with other students as well. So I'll be anxious to talk about some other aspects of my teaching and use of Annotation Studio, but I just wanted to give a brief introduction to my use of it. Thank you.
And finally, Mary Isabel.
Thanks. So yes, I'm very excited. All the things you've been talking about, I have some things to build on from there. I am sort of going to talk a little bit about my goals in optimizing Annotation Studio for myself. I'm going into the third semester using it in a composition class. I guess before the fall semester, I had a couple case studies that are on the HyperStudio website about some assignments that I was doing, and I kind of approached preparing for today by thinking about how to make those assignments a little bit better after trying them in the class. So first, a very practical comment about Annotation Studio. My ideal scenario in the classroom is that we're working on a digital text, but the students' devices are not open while we're talking. That sounded too good to be true, and yet it can actually work quite nicely. I think the other thing I'll just say, and what I'm sharing here is prompted by Annotation Studio. It's such a nice interface that I couldn't bear linking to it from our content management software that is clunky and should remain nameless. So I built a WordPress blog for my class now, and basically I have Google Docs linked in with my syllabus so I can keep updating the syllabus, and it updates into the blog. So you can go to this address at the top here and look through the syllabus with me, and in the spirit of an unconference, after I'm done with my comments, I'll share what I've said in a Google Doc that I'll share the link with all of you, and as we're talking, you can kind of pose questions and comments and keep the conversation going. So first I'll just say that when I was first using Annotation Studio, I was duplicating the reading process for my students. I was giving them a PDF through our content management software and trying to get them to annotate that PDF, and then doing work in class with Annotation Studio, exercises in class to have them engage a text in a certain way. It only now occurs to me that that was double the work and I didn't need to do it that way. So what I'm thinking of doing now is uploading those texts, having it either be an Annotation Studio reading, and that's where you're going to read it, or when you can't get a text up onto Annotation Studio because it's not available in plain text or it just is not quite going to work out, use that as an opportunity and actually take advantage of that as an opportunity to model for students how to annotate in a PDF, because students don't realize often that whether you're on a Mac or a PC, you can add comments into the, you can actually annotate these PDFs. Even they're not going to experience the world through Annotation Studio much as we'd like them to. So we better train them how to transition out of this really fun interface that we're giving them. So that's one thing I'm playing around with. And you'll see as you go down basically This is going to give you also an idea of what it'll look like for students to sort of first encounter links into Annotation Studio. And I also will talk in a second about introducing them to just registering and the importance of troubleshooting and teaching troubleshooting and learning how to work with students on getting involved with different technologies. But basically, we have the first engagement with a text will look like this. I'll say read. After you've registered for Annotation Studio, read Susan Glasswell's trifles, and I'll click on this, and it will redirect them. And I've already logged in on this computer, but they would need to log in if they hadn't already. And so they'll go right to the text right here. I should mention, I'll just go back over here. I'm kind of just making these rambling practical comments, and I'll throw these things out, and we'll talk about them as we will. Early on, when I give the components of the class, I gave considerable language, and this was actually discussed at the last workshop, and I borrowed the language and I kept building on it based on basically troubleshooting with students and realizing what they were running into. For each of the interfaces I have students engage, whether it's Google Docs, which we use a lot, Annotation Studio, Zotero, which I'm going to talk about how I'm linking those two up in exciting ways, and Wikipedia, I have instructions on how they should register. And because I've learned that they get tricked up on certain things, I have this breakdown and like me if this does not work before class, and we will sort this out, these sorts of things. So feel free, because you can get to this online, to borrow this and adapt it as you will. So I think the other important thing to remember here, and this is what I'm adding now, is, where did I put it? Maybe I haven't added it in yet here, or maybe it's earlier. I need to work into my syllabus some, so this is a syllabus in process. I haven't started the semester yet. That's another disclaimer. I think we have to be very clear when we introduce Annotation Studio how it's going to be evaluated, and I'm excited to hear what assessment discussion we have later today. But one thing I learned is that I would give them this, it's a tool, use this to build your paper, and yet some were engaging it a lot and some weren't, and in order to get them to really engage it, I needed to have them do it, evaluate it, give them a grade according to it, and for me that's a pass-fail grade. Did you engage the assignment or not? And they need to see that that's happening, and then they'll use it as a tool. So it would really otherwise be the best of the best students are going to use it, and the others won't take advantage of it or learn it. So that's another, definitely clearly represent how you will assess it and follow through on that, because it does seem like a tool that doesn't have, the paper gets the grade, maybe, not the annotations, but I do think you need to spend time grading the annotations. I'm building more time into my syllabus now to work with Annotation Studio documents. So it used to be that, like I said, we would have an in-class exercise to work with a text, and then we would go back out of that. I'm building multiple days now where we're engaging the text on different levels. And that leads to the first sort of innovation, I guess, on the case study that I was talking about. The assignment that I was working on was to have students take a primary text that we were reading and locate all of the places where the author had cited another text, just to highlight all of the things that were either paraphrase or quotation to show how much of the text came from somewhere else. And that seemed to me a really great way to kickstart their thinking about a close reading assignment, right? So I took a step back and thought more about that, and I realized what I was doing is basically telling them how to close read. And in the kind of assignment, I'm asking them really to come up with their own questions for inquiry, to come up with their own claims. And because I had really structured the way they approached that annotation process, I was predetermining the kind of papers I was going to get out of that. So with more time on the text, the first class I'm going to model using something like that, based on maybe what one student brings up in class. We'll say, how would we annotate it according to that? How would we find all of this? It could be a pattern of any sort. The next time I'll say, before class, create your own pattern according to questions you're having and keep those annotations private, right? And then maybe bring them into class discussion or not. And so basically using a collective annotation to model private annotation that then leads to more. Basically, I want in the composition classroom to avoid homogenization at all costs, right? So the second one student raises their hand and has a brilliant idea, you're going to get 20 papers on that idea, unless you reiterate over and over again that they need to come up with, their own unique ideas, right? So multiple days helps with that. tell me when I'm running out of time, because I'm just kind of going through these ideas.
3 more minutes.
Okay, good. So I'll skip ahead to the second assignment that I wanted to talk about, which I have linked in here. So I kind of skipped over the close reading, but this next assignment is entering a scholarly conversation. And this is the other case study that is up on the website. Before, what I was doing is having students read a grouping of scholarly texts, 3 scholarly articles. And then I would have students use Annotation Studio to go in and claim sources cited in those texts, find them at the library, and then annotate the first mention of that text with, this is a primary source, or this is a scholarly source, or a popular source. And the main goal of this source is fill in the blank. And what I describe in the case study is this is really efficient. You know, it gives all these students go and find these sources, bring them together, and we can have this really rich discussion about the article based on that. And so what I'm doing a little bit differently with that now is they weren't exactly taking advantage of the fact that they had done all of that annotation. I was saying you can use any of those scholarly articles and any text cited in those scholarly articles, but they weren't necessarily working with the second level. So I'm changing it slightly, and I'm saying choose one scholarly article, and you can enter a conversation with any of the sources cited in that one article. So that will force more of the engagement on that second level. I can clarify that if this is not coming across. But the other fun thing is that I wanted to make this really, I wanted you to be able to sort of link right from the annotation to really good information about that source. And I thought, maybe I'll put it on a PDF in Dropbox, and then we can link to the PDF, and I was getting all complicated about things. But then I started playing around with Zotero with my students. How many of you are familiar with Zotero? So I've been playing lately with creating a group, a Zotero group, and having students find sources in Zotero, add it to a shared class group to where everyone can see those sources there. And what's easy about that is once they've added it to the Zotero group, they can easily link to its page on the web, and everyone who belongs to that group. Basically, I'm creating a public group in Zotero and linking out to that in the document. So I'll just show you how I envision that looking in one of the articles, and I'm going to show it to you with maybe an unconventional text as what used to be 3 scholarly texts. This time we're going to do Benito Cereno and 3 articles on Benito Cereno. And the third of those articles is going to be the Wikipedia article, which should be fun if they've already gone there, but they didn't know we were going to be using that as an actual text. And so one trick, I'll just say this, when you're grabbing things, and I like the idea of using Annotation Studio to basically freeze something that lives online and bring it into the application to then engage it as a text in a way that they wouldn't if they're just going to Wikipedia. So grab it, but just know that formatting can be a little weird. So what I've done is just added a note at the beginning. I'm not going to take the time to take out all of those hyperlinks. I'm going to let it look like a Wikipedia page. And I'm going to tell students, I've tried, I've played around with it, maybe you guys have tweaks in mind. I can't get the links to open in a new tab. So anytime you click on the links, it takes you there. So I've just said, okay, to get back to this document, you'll have to go back in your browser window. So the first thing students will do when they read this Wikipedia article is read it, privately annotate it as they wish, and then at the end, claim one of these sources. So this is me saying, I'll be responsible for this source. And then the next class, they found it, or the next class after that. And here there's an annotation of the first mention of that source. We can expand it here as well. So we'll say, you know, this is a biography of Melville. I would call it a secondary text. I look up Knopf. It doesn't seem like it's an academic press, so I'm guessing it has not been peer reviewed. This is a student working through, this is me modeling, a student working through answering these questions. Our library didn't have this book. That's going to happen sometimes. So the student will say, I haven't read more than the Amazon preview, but this is the sense I got from the preview. And you can see the metadata for this book at this link. And so this is the shared sources for paper 2 folder, and students can go and find all of these there. So this collaborative work of bringing all these things into play for their assignments, I'm excited about adding this next layer. So I'll stop there. Thanks.